When you walk into a house, like a really well-built, beautiful house, you don't walk into the living room and immediately start looking for the rebar.
Right. Yeah, you're not pulling up the carpets.
Exactly. You don't peel back the drywall to check the load-bearing studs or um, dig up the floor to look at the concrete foundation. You just sit on the couch and admire the view.
Because the engineering that keeps the roof over your head is meant to fade into the background. It's supposed to be invisible.
It is. You experience the architecture exactly as it was designed to be experienced, completely invisible.
I mean, if you had to consciously think about the tensile strength of the steel beams every time you walk through the front door, the house wouldn't feel like a home.
Oh man, it would feel like a physics exam.
Yeah, exactly. The comfort relies on that invisibility.
But, and this is the core of what we're looking at today, if that foundation starts to crack, or if the ground underneath it shifts, suddenly the floors tilt.
The doors won't close, right?
Yeah, the drywall splinters. And in that moment of structural failure, you realize that your entire experience of that house where you can walk, how the rooms flow together, how safe you feel, it is completely dictated by frameworks you were never taught to see.
Which is a pretty profound realization.
It really is. So welcome to a very special deep dive. We are framing this as an installment of the Social Fabric Unraveled, which is a show created and produced by Adam Crenshaw.
And our mission today is to essentially peel back the drywall of our own society.
We are exploring the high-level, often completely invisible sociological realities of race, ethnic stratification, and power dynamics.
But to make those massive, abstract academic concepts concrete, we really need to move past pure theory.
Right, nobody just wants a textbook lecture.
No, exactly. So we are using the rapidly changing demographic evolution of the state of North Carolina as our real-world case study.
It provides this incredible real-time functioning model of these structural shifts happening across the American South, and really the entire country.
It's the perfect microcosm for this.
It really is. So why should you, the listener, care about this? Why spend your time unpacking sociological theories about demographic shifts in one specific state?
Well, because the society you navigate every single day is built on this stuff.
Yeah, the neighborhood you live in, the commute you drive, the school board elections you vote in, is all built on these invisible structures of categorization and power.
And understanding how those structures were built and, the mechanisms of how they operate, it's essentially the ultimate cheat code to understanding your own community.
It totally is. It moves you past just asking what is happening and allows you to finally see how it was engineered to happen.
Which is such a crucial distinction.
So, if we are going to examine the architecture of inequality, we have to start by looking at the raw materials.
Right. And the foundational building block of ethnic stratification in modern society is race.
But to understand how it functions sociologically, we had to completely dismantle the biological myths that most people still hold about what race actually is.
Because the misconceptions are just everywhere.
Oh, they are. Most of us walk around operating on this sort of folk biology. We think of race as a concrete genetic reality.
Like it's an undeniable scientific fact.
Yeah, like we assume it's baked deep into our DNA, dividing humanity into these distinct, mutually exclusive categories. But the biological data completely shatters the myth of the pure race.
It really does, because human DNA is basically 99.9% identical across the board.
Which is staggering when you think about it. Every single human on Earth shares that genetic baseline, 99.9%.
Right, so less than 0.1% of our DNA accounts for all the physical differences we actually observe.
Things like skin color, hair texture, facial structure.
Exactly. And that 0.1% is where society gets entirely tripped up by confusing two distinct scientific concepts, genotype and phenotype.
Okay, let's break that down. Genotype is your actual total genetic makeup, right?
Yes. And phenotype refers strictly to observable traits, the things we can actually physically see. And when geneticists map human variation, they find something that usually shocks people. 85% of human genetic variation happens within local populations, not between them.
I really want to pause on that because the implications are just enormous.
They completely rewrite how we think about categories.
Yeah. The sources provided this phenomenal analogy to break this down. They pointed out that if you pull two random people off the street in the exact same town in Norway, statistically, there is more underlying genetic variation between those two neighbors than there is between one of those Norwegians and a randomly selected person from Korea.
Which just completely breaks the brain of anyone relying on standard racial categories.
It really does. The genetic differences that we use to define race are just incredibly superficial.
They are. And another 5 to 9% of variation happens between local populations that we generally consider to be the, same race.
Oh, wow.
So you are left with this tiny fraction, just 6 to 9% of that 0.1% of varying DNA that actually dictates things like skin color or hair form.
That is microscopic.
It is. So biologically speaking, taking that microscopic sliver of phenotypic variance and claiming it represents distinct subspecies of humans is basically scientific malpractice.
There are just no pure races.
None.
The absurdity of it becomes crystal clear when you try to categorize humans by any other genetic trait.
Oh, right, like the malaria example.
Yeah. If society had arbitrarily decided to group humans by their genetic resistance to malaria, we would have a race that includes Norwegians and certain African groups.
Just because they share a lack of that specific genetic resistance.
Exactly. Or if we categorize people by their fingerprint patterns, like who has loops versus who has whorls, the racial lines would be completely redrawn overnight.
Right, or digestive capacities. Certain populations in Asia, Africa, and Southern Europe would be considered one unified race due to lactose intolerance,
While Northern Europeans and West Africans would form a completely different race.
It really highlights how arbitrary the whole thing is. Grouping people by skin color makes exactly as much biological sense as grouping them by fingerprint whorls.
It is just an arbitrary selection. Society chose a specific, highly visible phenotype and imbued it with massive structural significance.
Which leads right into the core sociological principle here. If race isn't a biological truth, it is a social construction.
Right. It's something we made up.
Exactly. Sociologists Michael Omi and Howard Wynot formalized this in their theory of racial formation.
And how do they define that?
They define it as the socio-historical process where racial categories are created, inhabited, transformed, and destroyed based on political struggle and changing social structures.
Which basically means race is something society invents, and more importantly, reinvents whenever the power dynamics require it.
Constantly reinventing it. We can look at the historical record right here in the United States to see this in action.
Oh, definitely. The concept of whiteness has not been static at all.
Not even close. In the mid-19th and early 20th centuries, massive waves of Irish, Italian, and Eastern European Jewish immigrants arrived in America.
And the dominant Anglo-Saxon population absolutely did not consider them white.
They didn't. They were subjected to intense scientific racism. Phrenology, the pseudoscience of measuring skull shapes, was used to, quote-unquote, prove that Irish or Italian immigrants were biologically distinct and inferior races.
Political cartoons depicted them with ape-like features. It was brutal.
It was. The dominant group created a racial boundary to justify treating these new arrivals as cheap, disposable labor.
But over the next few decades, boundaries moved.
Right, the category of whiteness expanded.
And it wasn't because their DNA changed. The mechanics of their assimilation into whiteness were deeply political.
Very political. As these immigrant groups organized into labor unions and formed powerful urban political machines like Tammany Hall in New York, they acquired actual political leverage.
And concurrently, as black populations migrated north for industrial jobs, the dominant power structure recognized a huge benefit in expanding the definition of white to include the Irish and Italians.
It was essentially unifying European descendants to maintain a demographic and political stronghold against black labor.
The social boundaries simply expanded to absorb them.
And we see that exact same mechanism of racial formation happening today.
Oh, absolutely. Just look at the intense debates surrounding the 2020 census regarding the Min-A classification.
Right, Middle East and North Africa.
Yeah. Currently, the Office of Management and Budget dictates that people from those regions are officially classified as white on government forms.
But if you actually talk to someone of Iranian or Egyptian descent living in the U.S., their lived experience does not align with the structural privileges of being white in America?
Not at all. They don't feel represented by that checkbox. And it has real, tangible consequences for them.
It really does. When a group is folded into a broader category like that, they lose the ability to track specific data on their community's health outcomes, economic disparities, or civil rights violation.
The arbitrary checkbox literally erases their specific sociological reality.
It wipes it out, which brings us to the ultimate question of motive.
Right, the why. Why did we invent these arbitrary skin color-based boxes in the first place?
The answer is ideological racism. The social construction of race was engineered to justify extreme inequality.
Because during the rise of the transatlantic slave trade and European colonialism, global powers found themselves with a massive economic incentive to enslave African populations and extract resources from indigenous lands.
Huge economic incentive. But you have a moral problem.
Yeah, how do supposedly enlightened religious nations justify the brutal subjugation of millions of people?
Right. You can't just admit you're doing it out of pure, unadulterated greed.
So you construct an ideology. You invent the false belief that these unchangeable physical traits are inextricably linked to intellectual, psychological, and moral characteristics.
You create a biological hierarchy, put yourself at the absolute top, and claim that the people you are exploiting are inherently scientifically inferior.
It creates a system where unequal distribution of wealth and human rights is viewed as the natural order of the world, rather than a violent, engineered economic system.
Ideological racism is basically the mortar that holds the bricks of ethnic stratification together. It allows the oppressor to justify the oppression.
Okay, so if race is a social tool constructed to build a hierarchy, we need to look at how that hierarchy actually functions day to day.
We need to examine the architecture of inequality.
Exactly. And this brings up a massive point of clarification about how we define the groups within this hierarchy.
This is where common language and sociological language really diverge.
Yeah, because in everyday conversation, we use the word minority as a math term. Like, if you have 10 people in a room and 4 of them want pizza, the pizza lovers are the minority. It just means less than 50%.
Right. But in sociology, that mathematical definition is entirely useless.
Completely useless.
In a sociological context, a minority group, or more accurately, a subordinate group, is defined entirely by a lack of power and the experience of unequal treatment.
It is a measure of your structural position in the hierarchy, not the demographic size of your population.
The historical example of South African apartheid illustrates this perfectly.
Oh, that's such a clear example. Yeah. Under apartheid, Black South Africans made up roughly 75% of the country's population.
So mathematically, they were the overwhelming majority.
Right. But sociologically, they were the subordinate minority because the white population, which sat at about 14%, held absolute control over the political system, the economy, the military, and the geographic distribution of land.
The power dynamic dictates the sociological reality, regardless of the headcount.
Numbers do not equal power.
Exactly. So sociologists identify a subordinate group by 5 specific compounding characteristics.
Let's run through those.
The first, as we've established, is that they experience unequal treatment and hold significantly less power over their own lives.
Okay, that makes sense.
The second is that they share distinguishing physical or cultural traits that the society has arbitrarily deemed significant. You know, the phenotypes we discussed earlier.
Right, the skin color or hair texture society fixates on.
Yeah.
And the third characteristic is involuntary membership. You are born into this categorization.
Yeah, you don't get to opt out of how the power structure perceives your racial or ethnic identity.
You can't just check a different box in real life.
No. The fourth characteristic is a strong sense of in-group solidarity. When a group shares the chronic, generational experience of subordination, it fosters a deep awareness of us versus them.
That shared struggle creates a very strong bond.
It does. And the fifth characteristic is a high rate of in-group marriage.
And historically, this isn't necessarily by preference, right?
Exactly. It's because the dominant group enforces segregation, either legally through anti-miscegenation laws or socially through redlining and intense community boundary keeping.
Okay, so let's flip the lens for a second and look at the dominant group. In the United States, the historical dominant group has been white Anglo-Saxon Protestants.
They sit at the top of the ethnic hierarchy, holding disproportionate access to wealth, property, and political leverage.
But it's not just about who has the most money. The most effective tool of the dominant group is cultural power.
Cultural power is massive. It's the ability to make your specific norms, your language, your holidays, and your historical narrative the default standard for the entire society.
It becomes the invisible baseline. Everyone else is expected to assimilate to that standard.
And when the dominant group's way of life is the default, any deviation from it is automatically categorized as abnormal, unprofessional, or inferior.
Which feeds directly into a brilliant and honestly devastating concept coined by sociologist William Ryan: blaming the victim.
Oh, this is one of those theories that once you understand the mechanics of it, you start seeing it everywhere.
You really do. When a minority group experiences higher poverty rates, lower educational outcomes, or higher incarceration rates, the dominant group uses ideological racism to explain it away.
Right. They say things like, Well, their culture doesn't value education, or they just don't have the work ethic.
They attribute the systemic failure to the victim's personal or cultural attributes.
Because they refuse to acknowledge the structural barriers like century-long practices of housing discrimination, the deliberate underfunding of minority school districts, or biased hiring algorithms that engineered the disparity in the first place.
Because if they acknowledge those structural barriers, they have to admit the system isn't a pure meritocracy.
And they don't want to do that. Blaming the victim is incredibly functional for the dominant group.
It really is. If the inequality is the fault of the minority group, then the dominant group is completely relieved of any moral or financial obligation to fix it.
Exactly. You don't have to restructure the tax code or rethink criminal justice if you can just tell yourself the losers of the system deserve to lose.
Wow. Okay, we've laid down a pretty heavy theoretical foundation here. We understand that race is a constructed tool and that stratification is a measure of power, maintained through cultural dominance and victim blaming.
So now, let's take these theories and apply them to a living, breathing ecosystem.
Yes. Let's look at the state of North Carolina.
North Carolina is a phenomenal case study because it isn't static. It is undergoing a hyper-accelerated demographic evolution.
The numbers are just wild. Between 2010 and the early 2020s, the state gained roughly 1.1 million new residents.
Pushing the total population to around 11.2 million.
To comprehend the scale of that growth, in just one decade, North Carolina added a population equivalent to the entire state of Rhode Island.
It outpaced the growth of Michigan, New Jersey, Ohio, and Virginia combined.
That is just a massive influx of humanity. And this boon is not being driven by a natural birth-over-death rate increase, right?
No, not at all. It is overwhelmingly driven by massive migration patterns. You have domestic migration people relocating from the Northeast and Midwest, chasing lower costs of living and better climates.
And you have significant international immigration. Structurally, North Carolina is transitioning from a historically agrarian, textile, and furniture manufacturing economy into a global hub for biotechnology, finance, and information technology.
And this economic engine is completely rewiring the racial and ethnic makeup of the state.
The sources highlight a metric called the diversity index. It calculates the statistical probability that if you choose two North Carolinians completely at random, they will be of different races or ethnicities.
And that index is now over 58%.
Over 58%. The state is rapidly moving away from the old, rigid, black-and-white binary of the Jim Crow South and hurtling toward a complex, majority-minority, pluralistic structure.
However, we have to remember a key mechanism of stratification is spatial geography. This diversity and growth are not evenly distributed at all.
There is intense spatial segregation occurring. The population boom is heavily concentrated in urban centers and their immediate suburban rings.
Right. Wake County, home to Raleigh, and Mecklenburg County, home to Charlotte, are absorbing massive shares of this influx.
Meanwhile, the rural areas are experiencing the exact opposite reality. Look at the data. 32 completely rural counties in North Carolina actually lost population during the same decade of unprecedented statewide growth.
It's a tale of two completely different states.
It is. If you are driving on I-40 through the Research Triangle, you are sitting in bumper-to-bumper traffic, surrounded by new housing developments, experiencing the immense strain of hypergrowth.
But if you drive 2 hours east, you're driving through hollowing out towns where the hospital has closed and the tax base is vanishing.
Sociologically, this geographic divide creates immense friction. You have booming, highly diverse, economically powerful urban centers demanding increased political representation, infrastructure funding, and progressive social policies.
And they're colliding directly with older, established power structures that are historically rural, predominantly white, and fiercely protective of the status quo.
So to truly dissect how this ethnic hierarchy functions on a granular level, we need to look at specific communities within this boom. Let's examine the fastest growing demographic in North Carolina, Asian Americans.
The growth here is staggering. Between 2010 and 2020, the Asian American population in the state exploded by 65%.
65% in a decade.
Yeah. And the mechanism driving this specific demographic surge is deeply tied to the economic transition we just discussed. A massive portion of this growth is employment-based migration.
We are looking at a highly targeted influx of skilled workers, largely arriving on H-1B visas, drawn to the technology, pharmaceutical, and academic corridors of the Research Triangle Raleigh, Durham, Chapel Hill, and Cary, as well as the banking headquarters in Charlotte.
Right. It's very specific sectors driving this.
Now, I want to push back on our structural theories for a second, or at least play devil's advocate. If you look at the aggregate top-line statistics for Asian Americans in North Carolina, they seem to defy the concept of ethnic stratification entirely.
I see where you're going with this.
They boast the highest educational attainment in the state. Their aggregate poverty rate is remarkably low, hovering around 12%. Their median household incomes frequently exceed $100,000,
And in affluent suburbs like Kari, it pushes past 135,000.
which dwarfs the statewide median. So if stratification is fundamentally about a dominant group suppressing minority groups and hoarding resources, how do we explain this profound economic success within a minority population?
It is a critical question, and answering it requires us to dismantle one of the most insidious tools of modern stratification, the model minority myth.
Let's get into it.
It is absolutely true that those aggregate top-line statistics are high. But flattening a massively diverse coalition of people into a single monolithic racial category called Asian obscures deep systemic economic disparities.
It's the exact problem we highlighted in part 1. We take an arbitrary census box and shove wildly different historical and socioeconomic realities into it, treating them as a single biological and cultural entity.
Precisely. When you break down the Asian American category in North Carolina, the diversity is just staggering. You have Indian Americans comprising 32% of that demographic,
Right.
Chinese Americans at 18%, Filipinos at 10%, Koreans at 10%, and Vietnamese Americans at 9%.
And the mechanisms of their arrival in the United States completely dictate their relationship to the economic power structure.
Exactly. The contrast is stark when you look at the specific migration pipelines. The 1965 Immigration Act prioritized highly skilled labor, effectively engineering a specific demographic profile.
So today, you have Indian Americans arriving largely via corporate-sponsored H-1B visas, funneling directly into lucrative software engineering and biotech roles in Wake County.
And nationally, their median income reflects this structural advantage, often sitting around $90,000 to $120,000.
Now contrast that highly engineered corporate migration pipeline with the experience of Vietnamese Americans.
It's a completely different reality. Many Vietnamese families did not arrive with advanced degrees and corporate sponsorships. They arrived as refugees in the 1970s and 80s, following the Vietnam War and the subsequent geopolitical destabilization.
They were resettled in different geographic patterns, often maintaining strong footholds in manufacturing-heavy areas like Greensboro. Their relationship to wealth accumulation, generational trauma, and structural barriers is entirely different.
And you also have groups like Bangladeshi Americans whose national median income is closer to $46,000.
So when the dominant group looks at the aggregate data and says, look at the Asian Americans in Cary making $135,000, they are actively erasing the economic struggles of the Southeast Asian refugee communities in Greensboro.
And that erasure is highly functional for the dominant group. The model minority myth is weaponized to maintain the hierarchy.
Weaponized how?
By pointing to the aggregate success of a highly selected, highly educated immigrant cohort, the dominant culture can push a narrative that racism is no longer a structural barrier in America.
Ah, I see. They can look at other minority groups, particularly Black and Hispanic populations, and say, well, the Asian community succeeded, so if you are failing, it must be a flaw in your own culture or work ethic.
Exactly. It is William Ryan's blaming the victim, just modernized for the 21st century.
It allows the power structure to validate the system as a pure meritocracy, while completely ignoring the structural advantages of arriving with a PhD versus arriving as a war refugee.
It's the invisible architecture modifying itself. It uses one group's specific, engineered migration context as a shield to deflect criticism from the rest of the unequal system.
That is just wild. Okay, so while the Asian American population represents a demographic surge tied to the modern globalized economy, North Carolina is also home to a minority group that has been fighting a trench war for their place in the hierarchy for well over a century. The Lumbee tribe.
The Lumbee provide one of the most profound case studies on how racial formation and legal definitions are manipulated by the dominant group.
They are the largest Native American tribe east of the Mississippi River, boasting over 55,000 members.
Descendants of the Chura and other Siouan-speaking peoples, heavily concentrated in and around Robeson County in the southeastern part of the state.
But their historical position within the Southern ethnic hierarchy has been incredibly complex. We always think of the Jim Crow South as a strict binary system, white and black.
But the state of North Carolina recognized the Lumbee as Indian as early as 1885.
This forced the state to create a third category within the segregated hierarchy.
The Lumbee existed in this strange liminal space. They were subjected to intense discrimination and segregation. They could not attend white schools or use white facilities.
But they also absolutely refused to be absorbed into the black segregated system.
So they had to physically build and maintain their own parallel infrastructure to protect their identity. They established their own educational system, including the Croatan Normal Indian School,
Which was founded specifically to train Native American teachers and eventually evolved into the University of North Carolina at Pembroke.
Their survival required fierce in-group solidarity and a constant vigilant defense of their community boundaries.
And sometimes that defense had to be aggressively physical. The sources detail a piece of history that is honestly just cinematic, the Battle of Hayes Pond.
Oh, this is an incredible moment in history.
It really is. In 1958, the Ku Klux Klan, led by a Grand Dragon named Catfish Cole, decided they were going to hold a massive armed rally in Robeson County.
And the explicit goal was to intimidate the Lumbee, who the Klan felt were getting too bold, and to reassert white supremacy in the county.
The Klan fully expected the Lumbee to tower. That was the dominant group's standard tool of terror. But the Lumbee understood the mechanics of power.
They absolutely did.
Instead of staying home, roughly 500 armed Lumbee men marched directly on the Klan rally at Hayes Pond. They surrounded the field, cut the whites, fired their weapons into the air, and completely routed the KKK.
The Klansmen dropped their weapons, abandoned their public address system, and literally fled into the swamps.
Catfish Cole was later indicted for inciting a riot. It made national news. It was a profound physical rejection of the dominant group's authority.
It was a huge victory, but while they could chase the Klan out of the county, the harder battle was against the invisible architecture of federal law.
Because in 1956, during an era when the federal government was actively trying to terminate its relationships with Native tribes, the U.S. Congress passed the Lumbee Act.
And this piece of legislation is a masterclass in how a dominant power structure manipulates legal definitions to maintain control.
The 1957 Act officially recognized the Lumbee as Indians. But in the exact same breath, the legislation explicitly denied them any of the federal benefits, services, or sovereign protections that are legally mandated to accompany federal recognition.
It was recognition in name only.
Basically just an asterisk.
Exactly. The federal government acknowledged their biological and historical existence, but structurally ensured they had no power. It denied them the government-to-government relationship that defines tribal sovereignty.
The Lumbee spent the next 70 years locked in a legal and political battle to remove that asterisk.
And they finally won. In late 2025 and early 2026, the Lumbee Fairness Act was passed, granting the Lumbee full federal recognition.
So from a sociological standpoint, we aren't just talking about access to better funding, right? What is the actual structural significance of this victory?
It is a massive shift in sovereign power. It fundamentally redefines their status in the American ethnic hierarchy.
Because for decades, they were managed by the state as a marginalized minority population within a paternalistic system.
Right. But full federal recognition acknowledges their inherent sovereignty. It establishes a nation-to-nation relationship with the United States.
It grants them access to federal funding for health, education, and economic development, sure. But fundamentally, it is a legal validation of their self-determination.
They claimed sovereignty over their own identity, organized politically, and forced the dominant power structure to legally concede it.
It's an incredible story of structural resistance. We are seeing groups like the Lumbee successfully claim structural power. We are seeing demographic engines like the Asian American and Hispanic populations literally changing the numerical realities of the state.
But sociology, specifically conflict theory, tells us that a dominant group never simply hands over its cultural power or its established privileges without intense friction.
Never. And that friction is defining the current political and social climate of North Carolina. To understand it, we have to look at the diverging generational demographics.
The white population in North Carolina is, on average, aging. Many are retirees moving to the coastal and mountain regions.
In stark contrast, the Hispanic population is incredibly youthful and rapidly expanding. Hispanic residents currently make up about 12% of the state's total population, but they account for roughly 18% of all children under the age of 5.
Throughout the 90s and 2000s, agriculture, meatpacking, and construction industries drew immigrant labor to rural eastern North Carolina.
And now, the second generation is coming of age. They are the demographic engine filling the public schools and revitalizing rural economies where the older, dominant populations are declining.
Now, as we discuss how the power structure reacts to this, we need to be incredibly clear about our analytical framework. We are wading into topics that are highly polarized in modern media.
Absolutely. This requires an explicit tone check for you, the listener. We are examining these cultural debates entirely through an impartial sociological lens.
They are not taking political sides, we are not assigning moral judgments, and we are not debating partisan policy.
We are merely reporting on the mechanics of how structural power reacts to demographic change, exactly as it is outlined in sociological conflict theory. Our goal is to map the architecture, not tell you how to vote.
Right. So with that established, conflict theory posits that when minority groups begin to achieve mathematical majorities in specific counties, or when they acquire enough political leverage to demand systemic changes, like equitable school funding, bilingual public services, or revised zoning laws, policies are introduced to address historical imbalances.
The subordinate groups are finally getting their hands on the levers of the architecture.
But the dominant group pushes back. We see this resistance constantly in local government.
You see fierce battles at school board meetings over curriculum changes or language policies. You see intense debates over quote-unquote reverse discrimination in university admissions or corporate hiring. You see pushback against the very concept of white privilege.
And sociologically, conflict theory explains that this resistance is rarely born of individual malice or personal bigotry. It is a structural reflex.
It stems from a profound fear that the dominant group's established way of life, their unquestioned cultural authority, and the automatic structural privileges they have historically enjoyed are being eroded.
When a group has been accustomed to structural dominance for centuries, the introduction of equity feels like oppression.
Let me repeat that because it is the linchpin of the entire dynamic. When you are accustomed to structural dominance, equity feels like oppression.
It perfectly explains the heat and anger in these local zoning and school board debates.
It also highlights a reality that I think a lot of people miss. In a democratic system, we assume numbers equal power. But that isn't necessarily true.
Not always, no.
Even as white residents become a mathematical minority in certain North Carolina counties or school districts, structural dominance can absolutely preserve their power.
And the mechanisms of preservation are highly effective. Through accumulated generational wealth, the dominant group can utilize urban gentrification to displace growing minority voting blocks from thriving city centers.
They can utilize complex zoning laws to prevent multifamily housing in affluent school districts.
Or, at the state level, they can engage in intense political redistricting, drawing legislative maps that dilute the voting power of clustered minority populations, ensuring the older, dominant demographic maintains control of the legislature.
The invisible architecture can be modified, reinforced, and redrawn to ensure the floor of the house stays perfectly level for the people who originally built it, even as the demographic ground underneath it completely shifts.
Power protects itself. It is infinitely adaptable.
The definitions of who belongs will be adjusted, the cultural norms will be heavily policed, and the legal boundaries will be rewritten, all to maintain the integrity of the hierarchy.
It's all about preservation.
Wow. This has been an incredibly dense, profound, deep dive today. We started by dismantling the illusion of biological race, realizing that our 99.9% identical DNA proves race is a fabricated social construct.
But a construct with brutal, very real consequences born from ideological racism.
We examine the architecture of inequality, learning that being a minority isn't about the math of a population, it's about a structural lack of power.
And we use the demographic explosion of North Carolina's 11.2 million residents to watch these theories operate in real time.
We saw how the model minority myth masks deep economic disparities among diverse Asian American subgroups. We witnessed the Lumbee tribe's century-long triumphant battle against the state and federal governments for sovereign recognition.
And we analyzed the friction that inevitably occurs when a youthful, diverse population challenges an aging dominant power structure that is fiercely protective of its cultural default.
It is a massive amount of information to process. But if there is one final provocative thought we can leave you with, it is this. Stratification thrives on our blindness.
The dominant culture expends a massive amount of energy teaching us to view unequal outcomes as the result of individual failures.
They want us to blame the victim, When we drive past a struggling neighborhood or an underfunded school, the system trains us to see a lack of personal work ethic, rather than the redlining, the zoning laws, and the historical marginalization that engineered that struggle.
The system wants you to sit on the couch and admire the living room and never ever think about the foundation.
But once you understand the social construction of race, once you see the mechanical gears of power and stratification turning, you cannot unsee them. The drywall becomes transparent.
And realizing that these structures are engineered isn't just an academic exercise. It is the mandatory first step toward changing them. You cannot fix a machine if you refuse to acknowledge how it was built.
So my challenge to you is to take this sociological lens and apply it to your own life. Tomorrow, look at your neighborhood. Look at the leadership in your workplace. Look at the demographics of your local city council. And ask yourself, who holds the structural power here?
And what invisible lines were drawn to keep it that way?
When you start looking for the rebar, the whole house looks different. Thank you for taking this deep dive with us. Keep questioning the architecture, keep untangling the social fabric, and we will catch you next time.